For decades, one image defined Hollywood's greatest friendship. Two men laughing as they leaped off a cliff, defying death with a smile. But behind that iconic moment from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was a story the world never knew. It was a 50-year bond built not just on movie sets and shared fame, but on private battles and unspoken tragedies. Now, after years of silence, the truth is finally coming out, not from tabloids or tell-all books, but from the one man who lived it, Robert Redford. Before they were Butch and Sundance, they were just two boys from opposite ends of America, living completely different lives. One was a rule follower, the other a rule breaker. One was shaped by order and duty, the other by rebellion and restlessness. Their paths were never supposed to cross, yet they were heading toward the same destiny. Paul Newman's story began in the quiet, comfortable suburbs of Shaker Heights, Ohio. Born on January 26, 1925, he was the son of Arthur Newman, the co-owner of a successful sporting goods store. It was a stable, middle-class life, and from a young age, Paul showed a creative spark. At just 7 years old, he played the court jester in a school production of Robin Hood. By 10, he was performing at the Cleveland Playhouse, a clear sign of the talent that was waiting to be discovered. His path seemed clear and straightforward, a product of his organized and moral upbringing. But then, the world went to war, and Paul Newman's life changed forever. In 1943, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy, hoping to become a pilot. He was sent to the Navy V-12 program at Yale University, but a routine physical uncovered a secret his famous blue eyes had been hiding. He was colorblind. His dream of flying was over. Instead, he was trained as a radio man and rear gunner for torpedo bombers. Stationed in the Pacific, his unit, Aviation Radio Man 3rd Class Newman, was assigned to the aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill just before the brutal Battle of Okinawa. Then, fate stepped in. On the day they were scheduled to fly out, Newman's pilot developed a severe ear infection, grounding the entire crew. The rest of their squadron flew to the carrier without them. Days later, the USS Bunker Hill was hit by 2 kamikaze planes, and the men they had trained with suffered devastating losses. Paul Newman survived because of a simple earache. That brush with death, that moment of pure luck, would stay with him for the rest of his life, shaping the man he would become. While Newman was learning about duty and fate in the Navy, Robert Redford was learning a different set of lessons on the streets of California. Born in Santa Monica on August 18, 1936, his childhood was far from the quiet stability of Shaker Heights. His father worked long hours, first as a milkman and later as an accountant, and the family moved to Van Nuys, a place Redford later called a cultural mud sea. He was a restless, freckle-faced kid who felt trapped by the boredom of suburban life. To escape, he became a rebel, climbing buildings and stealing hubcaps just for the thrill of it. But his rebellious spirit was tested early. At age 11, Redford contracted a mild case of polio. It wasn't severe enough to put him in an iron lung, but it was enough to leave him bedridden for weeks, a period of forced stillness for a boy who only wanted to move. This experience, this early battle, only fueled his desire for action and adventure later in life. He excelled at sports and earned a baseball scholarship to the University of Colorado. But his rebellious streak followed him. He started drinking, skipping classes, and was eventually kicked off the team, losing his scholarship. Lost and disillusioned, he drifted through Europe, trying to find himself as a painter before eventually landing in New York to study acting, a profession he once thought was ludicrous. One man was a war hero who narrowly escaped death and returned to study drama on the GI Bill. The other was a college dropout and a self-described outlaw who stumbled into acting. They were two sides of the American coin, forged by completely different fires, and in Hollywood, their two worlds were about to collide. By 1968, Paul Newman was more than a movie star. He was an icon. With films like The Hustler and Cool Hand Luke, he was one of the biggest names in the world. Robert Redford, on the other hand, was a relative unknown. His biggest claim to fame was starring opposite Jane Fonda in the romantic comedy Barefoot in the Park. He was a working actor, but he was far from a star. Then came a script called Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Redford read it and knew instantly that the part of the Sundance Kid was perfect for him. It tapped into that restless outlaw spirit he had carried his whole life. But the studio, 20th Century Fox, had other plans. They wanted a star as big as Newman to play Sundance, and Redford wasn't on their list. The director, George Roy Hill, fought for him, but the studio wouldn't budge. They forced Hill to meet with other big-name actors, but he knew Redford was the one. The stalemate continued for months. The studio tried everything to keep Redford out of the film. Finally, it all came down to one man, Paul Newman. He had the power to get the movie made, and he had the power to choose his co-star. He and Redford met in Newman's apartment in New York. Newman listened to the studio's concerns, and then he made a decision that would not only change Redford's career, but would also forge a bond of loyalty that would last a lifetime. He stood up to the studio heads and told them he wanted to work with an actor, not just another star. He put his own reputation on the line for a man he barely knew. Redford would later say he didn't know how many people in Hollywood would have done that. Most would have listened to their agents or the studio powers. But Newman was different. His support was the only reason Redford was cast in the film. It was an act of integrity that Redford never forgot. He said, "I always felt that I owed Paul for that." This moment became the bedrock of their friendship. It wasn't about fame or money. It was about respect for the craft. Newman saw something in Redford that the studio didn't, a shared dedication to the work that went beyond the surface of Hollywood. The studio finally gave in, but with one last condition. Since Newman was the bigger star, they insisted on changing the title. The film was originally called The Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy. But to appease the studio, they flipped the names, putting Newman's character first. It was a small price to pay. The two men were finally united on screen, and a legendary partnership was born. On the set of Butch Cassidy and later The Sting, their friendship took on a unique rhythm. When the cameras were rolling, they were the ultimate professionals. Both men came from a background of theater and live television, and they shared a deep respect for the craft of acting. Newman was known for being intensely engaged and liked a lot of rehearsal. They would spend hours digging into their characters, challenging each other to make every scene better. But the moment the director yelled "cut," a different dynamic took over. They were, as Redford described, fundamentally American actors, full of irreverence, fun, and a constant desire for one-upmanship. Their on-set relationship had its own set of rules. Redford had to laugh at all of Newman's god-awful jokes, and Newman had to tolerate Redford showing up 10 to 15 minutes late all the time. Newman even gave Redford a pillow embroidered with the phrase, "Punctuality is the courtesy of kings," teasing that his friend had lost his punctuality somewhere between their first and second films. This playful rivalry was their way of staying grounded. In a world that treated them like icons, they needed a way to remind each other and themselves that they were just two guys. Redford explained that if you're viewed as an icon, you need a mechanism to take yourself down to keep the balance. For them, that mechanism was an epic, long-running prank war. The most legendary of these pranks revolved around Newman's passion for auto racing. After filming Butch Cassidy, Newman took a Porsche that Redford owned for a drive and instantly fell in love with racing. He got really good with incredible reflexes, but he talked about it so much that it drove Redford crazy. So for Newman's 50th birthday, Redford decided to send a message. He went to a junkyard in Connecticut, found a completely demolished Porsche shell, had it gift-wrapped with a ribbon, and delivered it to Newman's porch with a note that said, "Happy 50th." Newman never said a word about it. For weeks, there was only silence. Then Redford came home to his rented house one day and found a gigantic, impossibly heavy crate in the middle of his living room. It was so heavy it had dented the floorboards. Inside was the Porsche, crushed into a solid cube of molten metal. Newman had gotten his revenge. But Redford wasn't done. He had the block of metal transported to a sculptor friend and commissioned a piece of art. He described it as a really ugly sculpture. Then, he had it secretly dropped into the middle of Paul Newman's pristine garden. To the day Newman died, neither man ever spoke a single word to the other about the Porsche, the cube, or the sculpture. The joke was so perfect that any words would have ruined it. It was a testament to a friendship that, as Redford said, didn't need a lot of words. While the world saw the laughter, the pranks, and the on-screen magic, a deeper, more somber connection was forming between the two men, rooted in a kind of parallel tragedy that few people knew about. Both Robert Redford and Paul Newman carried a private burden that would secretly define their lives. Both men lost a son. In 1958, a young Robert Redford married Lola Van Wagenen, a college student from Utah. They were just starting out, living a quiet life far from the glare of Hollywood. In September 1959, their first child was born, a son they named Scott Anthony Redford. But their joy was tragically short-lived. Just 2.5 months later, on November 17, 1959, their infant son died from sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. It was a devastating blow, a private heartbreak that Redford rarely ever spoke about publicly. He and Lola were left to grieve an unimaginable loss long before he became the Sundance Kid. Nearly 2 decades later, tragedy struck Paul Newman's family in a painfully similar way. Newman had a son from his first marriage to Jackie Witt, and his name was also Scott. Scott Newman grew up in the immense shadow of his world-famous father. He tried to follow in his footsteps, becoming an actor himself, but he struggled with the pressure of being Paul Newman's son. He once said, "It's hell being his son. I don't have his blue eyes. I don't have his talent. I don't have his luck. I don't have anything. That's me." On November 20th, 1978, at the age of 28, Scott Newman died from an accidental overdose of alcohol and drugs. The loss sent Paul Newman into a spiral of guilt that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In a posthumous memoir, he confessed his deepest regrets. "I kept thinking he was going through a phase of adolescent bad judgment," Newman wrote. "I never thought it would be fatal." He endlessly questioned himself, wondering if there was something he could have done. Was there some way I might have told him he didn't have to be like me? That he didn't have to do macho things and could just be himself? The pain was so deep that he admitted, "Many are the times I have gotten down on my knees and asked for Scott's forgiveness." This unspoken pain became the hidden fuel for a shared mission that would come to define the second half of their lives. As they grew older, both Newman and Redford became increasingly focused on a shared belief. As Redford put it, "If you are fortunate enough to have success, you should put something back." For both men, this wasn't just a nice idea. It was a guiding principle. They used their fame and fortune to build legacies that would outlast any film, and they did it by fighting for independence. For Paul Newman, the path to giving back started in his own kitchen. He began bottling his homemade salad dressing to give to friends as gifts. It became so popular that he, along with his friend A.E. Hotchner, decided to turn it into a business called Newman's Own. From the very beginning, Newman made a promise. He would donate 100% of the profits to charity. This decision gave him complete financial independence from Hollywood to fund the causes he cared about. Over the years, Newman's Own has donated hundreds of millions of dollars to thousands of charities. His most personal project grew directly from his personal pain. In 1988, he founded the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang Camp, a place where seriously ill children could escape their treatments and just be kids. It was a place of fun and mischief, built in memory of a son he couldn't save. The camp grew into the Serious Fun Children's Network, a global community of camps that has helped hundreds of thousands of children and their families. In this work, Newman wasn't an actor playing a hero. He was a hero in a real way. While Newman was building a legacy of charity, Robert Redford was building a legacy of art. He had grown tired of the Hollywood studio system, which he felt stifled creativity and ignored unique voices. So in 1980, he founded the Sundance Institute in Utah. His goal was to create a space where independent filmmakers could develop their projects and nurture their talent, free from studio control. This initiative gave rise to the Sundance Film Festival, which has become the most important platform for independent film in the world, launching the careers of countless directors and writers. Just as Newman created financial independence for his philanthropy, Redford created artistic independence for a new generation of storytellers. They were fighting parallel battles, using their success to empower others. And through it all, they supported each other. They showed up at each other's events and helped each other financially. It was a quiet partnership built on a shared understanding that their true purpose extended far beyond the movie screen. For years, fans clamored for a third film. Why did Hollywood's greatest duo never team up again after The Sting? The truth is, it wasn't for a lack of trying. For more than 13 years, Redford, Newman, and director George Roy Hill actively looked for another script they could do together. But the bar had been set impossibly high. They knew they had captured lightning in a bottle twice, and they refused to make a third film just for the money or the nostalgia. They couldn't find a story that was special enough to live up to the legacy of Butch Cassidy and The Sting. They came close only once. In the late 1990s, Redford acquired the rights to Bill Bryson's book, A Walk in the Woods, a story about two older friends who reconnect while hiking the Appalachian Trail. It seemed perfect, a quiet, character-driven story for two aging icons. Redford brought the project to Newman, but by then his old friend's health was failing. Newman felt he was too old and not physically capable of handling the demands of the role, and he regretfully turned it down. He would only appear in one more live-action film, Road to Perdition, before retiring. The opportunity was lost forever. In the final months of Newman's life as he battled cancer, Redford went to visit him at his home in Connecticut. He knew the deal, and Newman knew the deal. The end was near, but they didn't talk about it. There was no need for tearful goodbyes or grand speeches. Instead, they sat and talked about what was on their minds: the upcoming election, politics, and what needed to be done in the world. Their friendship was real and present, right up to the very end. Paul Newman passed away on September 26, 2008, at the age of 83. The world mourned the loss of a legend. Tributes poured in from everyone. But the statement that mattered most came from his oldest friend. It was short, simple, and powerful. Robert Redford said, "There is a point where feelings go beyond words. I have lost a real friend. My life, and this country, is better for his being in it." In the end, what Robert Redford finally spoke up about wasn't a hidden feud or a dark Hollywood secret. It was the quiet 50-year story of a brotherhood forged in an act of loyalty, tested by fame, and deepened by a grief that only they could understand. The world saw two movie stars, but Redford saw a brother. And in a world of fleeting celebrity, their true, lasting legacy was not just in the iconic films they made, but in the rare and real friendship they shared.